They say America was founded on the principles of freedom and democracy, but what if that, well, was never true? Take a closer look. What's on the US dollar bill? Not the national flag, not a portrait of a president, but an unfinished pyramid. At the top, a single eye staring straight at you. At the base, a Latin phrase, Novus Ordo Seclorum, the new order of the world. What kind of freedom chooses the symbol of total control? Who were the founding fathers? George Washington, not just the first president, but a master mason, Benjamin Franklin, not just an inventor, but the grand master of a secret lodge in France. They didn't just found a nation, they established an order. And Washington, D.C.? It was designed from the ground up as a giant open-air lodge where the most powerful buildings form Masonic symbols when connected on a map. Is this the capital of a republic, or a temple built for an ancient secret society? Maybe. The American Revolution wasn't the birth of freedom. Maybe it was the elegant unveiling of a hidden control system, built on symbols, powered by rituals, and kept alive through absolute silence. And maybe America was never the land of liberty, but the global headquarters of Freemasonry. A $1 bill, the most ordinary piece of currency in America. But if you hold it up and flip it over, you'll see something strange, an unfinished pyramid, and above it, a single, wide-open eye set inside a glowing triangle. Below it reads the phrase Novus Ordo Seclorum. Americans carry this bill every day, yet almost no one asks, why would a modern Christian nation use an ancient Egyptian symbol? Why is the Great Seal written in Latin, a dead language? And why is the all-seeing eye, a symbol deeply tied to secret societies, placed at the very heart of the most powerful currency on earth? The answer, like all answers that are truly unsettling, doesn't lie on the surface. In 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was signed, Americans were told they were breaking free from monarchy. But behind the scenes, a small, silent group was building something else. Not to replace kings, but to control the new system from the shadows. They didn't use weapons, they used symbols. They embedded whispers into the very language of founding documents, whispers only their own could understand. The all-seeing eye, the pyramid, the radiant light from above. These aren't random decorations. They are core symbols of Freemasonry, a secretive fraternity said to have roots in medieval stonemason guilds, but whose rituals trace back even further. Perhaps to Egypt, perhaps to Babylon, or perhaps to something history has deliberately hidden. What's most striking is that the first designers of America's national symbols, men like Charles Thomson, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson, all had deep ties to the Masonic order. Jefferson's involvement is debated, but Franklin's is not. He served as a Grand Master, the head of a powerful lodge in France, where he regularly attended secret meetings alongside Enlightenment philosophers and anti-monarchy nobles. It's hard to believe that these men, architects of modern democracy, didn't know exactly what symbols they were placing on the nation's seal. They didn't choose the eagle by accident, they didn't add a pyramid for aesthetic flair, and they certainly didn't inscribe New Order of the World on the dollar just for decoration. There is a core rule in Freemasonry: he who knows, sees. Symbols are not explained because they don't need to be explained to outsiders. They are signals meant only for those who have awakened, those who have passed through the 3 degrees of enlightenment: apprentice, fellowcraft, and master. To the average person, they're just design elements. To the initiated, they are commands. And so we return to the original question: was America really built on democracy, or on the foundation of a secret society older than the country itself? If this is a land of liberty, then why was the first Declaration of Freedom written in the language of a secret brotherhood? If this is a government of the people, then why were its designers meeting in shadows, swearing oaths of silence, and embedding codes into every national emblem that ordinary citizens were never meant to understand. You might say it's all coincidence, an aesthetic choice, a historical artifact of its time, but do you still believe in coincidence when it repeats itself hundreds of times over centuries? A small symbol in the Declaration of Independence was only the beginning. Because once we start looking closer, we begin to see the same traces everywhere. In official portraits of George Washington, you'll notice something unusual. He's not always wearing a general's uniform or presidential cloak. In some, he's dressed in a white apron, carefully hand-embroidered. But it's not a blacksmith's apron, it's the sacred garment of a master mason, a man who has completed the 3 degrees of enlightenment within the secret order. That apron is one of the most revered symbols in Freemasonry. It doesn't just represent purity, it's a vow of silence, a pledge of loyalty to an invisible order, and a lifelong commitment to an unfinished architecture, a structure that Masons believe they are tasked to build through knowledge and action. And the compass, often paired with the square, it forms the foundation of the Masonic emblem. The compass represents reason and guidance. The square stands for morality, 2 pillars needed to build an ordered society. And the small gavel seen in Masonic rituals. It's not just ceremonial. It symbolizes the awakening tap, the moment a person begins to rise out of ignorance and start the path of inner reconstruction. These tools aren't confined to the lodge. They've moved beyond ritual. They've entered politics, embedded in speeches, architecture, and even legislative design. And when Washington wore that apron during the cornerstone ceremony of Capitol Hill, it wasn't symbolic coincidence. On September 18, 1793, during the laying of the first stone of the United States Capitol, George Washington appeared not as president, but as a master mason, wearing the full Masonic regalia, white apron, white gloves, and the badge of his lodge. He didn't perform a civil ceremony. He poured wine, scattered grain, and anointed the stone with oil, according to ancient Masonic rites, not any official state protocol. That moment was captured in paintings, preserved in lodge records, and remembered by eyewitnesses. But strangely, you won't find it in your high school history textbook. Why not? Perhaps because it forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Was America truly built as a secular republic? Or was it born through rituals, symbols, and silent oaths, not tied to any religion, but to a secret fraternity with roots deeper than Christianity itself? It wasn't just Washington. Benjamin Franklin was also a high-ranking Mason, Grand Master of the Supreme Lodge of France. He once praised Masonic philosophy as a guiding light for all mankind. In Paris, during late-night gatherings with Enlightenment thinkers, Franklin didn't just discuss diplomatic strategy. He talked about creating a new world order, one where reason, not bloodline, would determine power. And if you look closely, you'll see that reflected in the very structure of the United States, a nation with no king, no official church, no inherited throne, but a constitution that grants power through light and the light of human reason. Sounds very Masonic, doesn't it? But there's something even more subtle. When the Founding Fathers wore white aprons, they weren't just declaring their membership in a secret society. They were saying they were builders, not builders of houses, but of systems, of society, of an order, an unfinished structure they called the United States of America. And if they were the builders, then who was the architect? That is the question no one has dared to answer. To understand how the Freemasons came to wield such deep influence over American history, we need to return to the beginning. How did Freemasonry make its way to the New World? There was no grand procession, no army escort. This secret society didn't arrive with weapons. It arrived with symbols and with an extraordinary purpose: to plant order where there was chaos. The true origin of Freemasonry remains a mystery. Some scholars believe it emerged from medieval cathedral builders' guilds in Europe, groups responsible for the great Gothic cathedrals of Chartres and Salisbury. These structures weren't just architectural feats, they were physical embodiments of sacred symbolism. These builders formed tightly guarded brotherhoods with their own codes, rituals, and a strict rule. Only the enlightened were taught the craft. But there is another version of history, one less frequently told. It suggests that Freemasonry is a descendant of far older mystery schools, tracing back to ancient Egypt, Greece, or even Babylon. These weren't just builders of stone, they were architects of worldview. By the 17th century, when sacred temples were no longer being constructed, these brotherhoods shifted focus. They began to build people. Their mission became social reconstruction through philosophy, symbolism, and the radical idea of individual liberty. Freemasonry became a gathering place for nobles, scholars, merchants, and thinkers, people who no longer found freedom in the church, but also refused to bow to monarchs, and, from England, Scotland, and France, Masonic lodges began spreading quietly across Europe. When Europeans crossed the Atlantic to colonize the New World, Freemasonry crossed with them. But they didn't come as missionaries, they came as seed planters to cultivate a new society built on liberty, free from the grip of thrones and popes. The first Masonic lodge in North America was established in 1733 in Boston under the charter of the Grand Lodge of England. Its founder, Henry Price, was a cloth merchant, but also a Mason authorized to bring the light to the new continent. Soon after, lodges appeared in Philadelphia, New York, Charleston. Not long after that, names like George Washington, Paul Revere, and John Hancock would become members. But what's truly notable is this: Freemasonry didn't limit itself to nobles or scholars. It recruited people of practical influence, printers, silversmiths, local generals. They weren't looking for royal blood, they were looking for builders, people with the potential to shape. It's no coincidence that nearly every major colonial capital had at least one active lodge operating quietly in the background. At a time when the colonies were fractured and lacked a central government, these lodges functioned as hidden centers of unity, places where people spoke the same symbolic language, shared a common set of values, and aligned around one goal: enlightening society through reasoned order. So when revolution erupted, the Masons were already in position. They didn't need to seize power, they had laid the foundation long before. Some scholars have even raised a provocative question: did the 13 colonies truly rise up against Britain spontaneously, or was the entire movement premeditated, coordinated in secret lodge meetings from Boston to Philadelphia? We have no leaked blueprint to confirm that. But the symbolic alignment, shared language, and interwoven networks among the revolution's key leaders, it's hard to write that off as coincidence. Freemasonry didn't come to the New World with armies. It came with ideas. It quietly took root, lodge by lodge, person by person. And among those early seed planters of this hidden order was a particularly unique name, a man who was both scientist and silent architect of a new world: Benjamin Franklin, a man who didn't just unlock the secrets of lightning, but also built bridges between lodges on both sides of the Atlantic, using a power that was never written on parchment. Franklin is widely remembered as a symbol of the Enlightenment, the man who invented the lightning rod, improved the printing press, and skillfully persuaded France to join America's war for independence. But there's another side of him, one that's rarely mentioned in schoolbooks and perhaps deliberately forgotten. He was a Grand Master, the highest-ranking Mason in a powerful French lodge. This isn't speculation, it's documented history. In 1779, while serving as America's ambassador to France, Franklin was appointed honorary Grand Master of the Lodge Les Neuf Sœurs, one of the most influential Masonic lodges in Europe, a gathering place for the intellectual and political elite who opposed monarchy. The name The Nine Sisters didn't just evoke the arts, it reflected a deeper mission: to redefine society using the light of reason. There, Franklin met Voltaire, Diderot, Condorcet, thinkers who helped shape the ideological foundations of both the French and American revolutions. But these meetings weren't public. They took place behind closed doors, and the discussions weren't just about politics, but about a new global order, a concept deeply embedded in Freemason writings of that era. What's striking is this: Franklin wasn't just an honorary guest. He presided over Masonic ceremonies. He initiated new members. He helped design symbols, mottos, and contributed to the philosophical blueprint for building not just a country, but a social experiment rooted in the teachings of a secret order. So the question arises, did Franklin serve his country or his lodge? Or to him, were those one and the same? Some scholars have debated whether Franklin was a kind of ideological spy for Europe. But maybe the truth is more complex. He wasn't spying for anyone. He was a link, a bridge between two worlds. One, the old world crumbling under royal rule, and the other, a new world rising from the ashes, built not on scripture, but on the symbols of Masonry. In private letters, Franklin once wrote, "Freedom is not just a right, it's a construction. And every construction needs a builder who can read the blueprint." You might think he was being philosophical, but if you're a Mason, you'd understand. The blueprint he spoke of is the great architect's plan, the sacred design that members swear to build, not with words, but through quiet, deliberate action. While in France, Franklin helped establish several new lodges, including ones that actively recruited officers, merchants, and intellectuals preparing to journey to America. So in many ways, Franklin wasn't just forging military alliances, he was constructing a transatlantic Enlightenment network. And when he returned to America, he brought back not only aid, but an entire ideology wrapped in symbols, vows, and philosophies that were never meant to appear in any official document. So the next time you look at a portrait of Benjamin Franklin, you may see the warm smile, the glasses in hand, the grandfatherly gaze. But don't forget, that man sat in meetings without records, debated ideas that were never written down, and helped birth a nation like no other in history. He wasn't just a founding father. He was one of the invisible architects of an order, one we still may not fully understand today. Franklin laid the ideological foundation for a new America, not just through diplomacy or science, but through the symbols of a secret fraternity he represented. But Franklin wasn't alone. Around him stood men who didn't just talk about building a nation, they saw themselves quite literally as builders, and to them revolution wasn't an act of rebellion, it was a construction project, brick by brick, oath by oath. You might be familiar with the Founding Fathers as battlefield heroes or political visionaries. But what few remember is that many of them were actual builders, not of homes, but members of the Freemasons, the ancient and accepted order of Freemasons. And they weren't a fringe group. According to historical records, more than 50% of senior officers in the American Revolutionary Army were Masons. They met in lodges, swore their vows by candlelight, used secret handshakes, encoded symbols, and above all, shared a single philosophy. Freedom doesn't come from blood, it comes from will. And freedom must be built as a long-term project. George Washington, the Commander-in-Chief, was a master Mason, initiated in 1752 at the Fredericksburg Lodge. He personally presided over initiation ceremonies for his officers. Some historians suggest that Washington used Freemasonry, to instill discipline and unity among soldiers from different colonies, at a time when America had no constitution. Paul Revere, the rider who warned, "The British are coming," was a veteran Mason who later served as Grand Master of Massachusetts. On the night he left Boston, he didn't just carry a military signal, he carried a coded message for local lodges to activate a parallel network alongside the official army. John Hancock, the man with the boldest signature on the Declaration of Independence, was also a Mason, and so were future presidents like James Monroe, Andrew Jackson, James Polk, James Buchanan, Andrew Johnson, and William McKinley. And the list goes on. During the Revolutionary period, Masonic lodges functioned like shadow command centers. There, officers met not as military superiors and subordinates, but as brothers, equal in the lodge, bound by oaths, and free to discuss strategies, ideals, ethics, even plans never recorded in official transcripts. This is key. In a time when the colonies were fractured, when the Continental Congress was fragile, Freemasonry provided a non-governmental, non-religious, but highly effective network. A nation within a brotherhood operating in parallel, quietly but powerfully. Members came from different states, faiths, and social classes, but inside the lodge they removed their uniforms, their titles, their pride. They wore white aprons, stood in a circle, and addressed each other as equals. There was no king, no priest, only silence, and the shared goal of building a new kind of human being. In that atmosphere, many key decisions weren't made in congressional chambers, but in lodge meetings, among men who had sworn sacred vows together. What was said in lodge was never spoken outside, but what followed, from battlefield strategies to the clauses of the Constitution, bore the familiar imprint of Masonic philosophy. So when people say America was built by Enlightenment thinkers, that's not just a metaphor. They were builders in every sense of the word, not just politically, but symbolically, as Freemasons. And like all great builders, they didn't leave their names behind. They left behind symbols. Symbols we still see, every day, on our money, in our monuments, and deeper still, in the way America understands freedom, order, and power. In the collective memory of American history, Paul Revere is the midnight rider, the lone hero galloping through the night shouting, "The British are coming!" like a thunderclap meant to awaken a nation. But the version told in school books has been stripped down to the point of lifelessness, because in truth, Revere wasn't simply a warner of war, he was the spark that activated a network long prepared. A network that didn't belong to the army or the government. It belonged to Freemasonry. Paul Revere was a silversmith, a businessman. But more importantly, he was a master Mason and at one point, Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts. He wasn't just a participant, he was an organizer, a coordinator, a leader in one of the most active lodges in Boston at the time. Meetings were held in secret, under ancient ritual with symbols, handshakes, and vows of silence. On the night of April 18, 1775, Revere left Boston under cover of darkness, riding through towns and villages to warn of the British advance toward Lexington and Concord. But he wasn't just alerting farmers and militiamen, he was knocking on the doors of fellow Masons. Men he knew were waiting for a signal. They didn't need long explanations. A look, a simple gesture. That was enough to activate the entire network. Historical records mention the use of lantern signals from the steeple of Old North Church, one if by land, two if by sea. But the real question is, who understood the signal well enough to mobilize instantly? The answer, a hidden Masonic network that Revere and his fellow brothers had quietly built over years. At that time, Boston was one of the Masonic capitals of the New World, Dozens of lodges were active, from official chapters under the English Grand Lodge to independent local ones founded by colonists themselves. They may have differed in hierarchy, but they shared the same codes. And one mission: to liberate humanity from the grip of kings and churches. When Revere knocked on doors that night, he wasn't doing it randomly. He knew exactly who had taken the oath, who was responsible for spreading the next signal, who had the means to rally the local militia. This wasn't the lone act of a folk hero. It was the final phase of a long orchestrated plan to activate a secret network. What makes Paul Revere's story truly remarkable is this: the American Revolution didn't begin with the sound of gunfire. It began with a signal. And that signal wasn't just a warning to the British. It was a summons to an underground order that had quietly waited for the moment to rise. Not everyone understood what Revere was doing that night. To the common citizen, he was a man shouting a warning, but to the Masons sleeping in Lexington or Concord, it was a password, a wake-up call for a machine finely tuned and ready to move. Like a lodge awaiting its ritual hour, revolution didn't erupt spontaneously. It erupted when the key holder knocked at the right door, at the exact right moment. And on that dark April night, the key holder was a lone rider, a silversmith on horseback. But behind him was a silent network, vast, precise, and more organized than any army the British could have imagined. If you could travel back in time to mid-18th century Boston, you'd find a city strung as tight as a drawn bow, British authorities tightening tax laws, soldiers patrolling the streets, civilians divided between loyalty and rebellion. But there was something else. Something that didn't appear on any map, wasn't reported in the papers, and certainly wasn't written in government records. A network of underground Masonic lodges operating in the heart of the city. From the outside, these lodges looked like nothing more than modest buildings. But inside, they were their own worlds, meeting rooms adorned with symbols, chairs arranged by rank, lighting set according to ritual, and above all, an oath of silence, sworn by every member before stepping into any position of influence. Boston didn't just have one lodge, it had many operating simultaneously. Some were officially aligned with the British Grand Lodge, loyal to the Crown, but others, like St. Andrew's Lodge, were locally founded, gathering American Masons who were slowly separating themselves from British control. In those American lodges, the debates weren't about whether revolution should happen, but about when it should begin. What made these lodges dangerous to the British wasn't their size. It was how they operated outside the reach of all political systems. A lodge wasn't a party, it wasn't a church, it wasn't a military unit, so it couldn't be regulated, shut down, or disbanded under any official law. That's why British officers stationed in Boston were deeply uneasy about this invisible force, even though they could never prove anything tangible, and their fears were justified, because the lodges were filled with men of real influence, wealthy merchants, sharp lawyers, skilled printers, silversmiths, carpenters, men who didn't appear on political rosters but who shaped public sentiment. They didn't command with power, they led through internal respect, built through ritual, trials, and a code of trust. Even as Boston came under military occupation, the lodges continued to operate. Not publicly, but not entirely in hiding either. Meetings moved to members' homes or to taverns with private cellars, like the Green Dragon Tavern, considered by many the nerve center of the American Revolutionary Movement. It's widely believed that the Sons of Liberty, the grassroots organization that helped ignite the revolution, was born there. And unsurprisingly, many of its members were Masons: Paul Revere, Joseph Warren, John Hancock, and very likely Samuel Adams. The lodge meetings weren't just philosophical discussions about liberty. They were operational, financial planning, message routes, spy networks, even weapon preparations, all concealed under the simple banner of a fraternal meeting. No minutes, no press coverage, no direct evidence. Just a strange synchronicity between lodge decisions and official political developments, as if another mind was quietly steering things from the shadows. And here's the most remarkable part. The British knew, but they couldn't stop it. They couldn't arrest all the members of Uba because they didn't know who they were. They couldn't ban the lodges, or there was no legal cause, and they certainly couldn't infiltrate because no one outside the initiated could even understand the codes. Boston, through the eyes of Freemasonry, was not an occupied city. It was a chessboard. And while the British believed they held the king, the lodges were already moving the pawns, the rooks, and the bishops into place. So by the time the first shot rang out at Lexington, every piece was exactly where it needed to be. On April 30th, 1789, George Washington stood on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City, placed his hand on a Bible, and took the oath of office to become the first President of the United States. The crowd cheered, flags waved, history remembers it as the defining moment of modern democracy. But there's something almost no one ever mentions. The Bible Washington swore upon did not belong to the government, nor to any church. It belonged to a Masonic lodge, more precisely, St. John's Lodge No. 1 under the Grand Lodge of New York. It was their Bible that was borrowed for the ceremony, because the new federal government simply didn't have one ready. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, because many of the men organizing the inauguration, and many of the ones standing beside Washington that day, were also Freemasons. And if you look closely at paintings of the event, you'll notice something subtle. Washington is wearing white gloves, standing in the ritual posture of a Mason, with his right hand placed on an open Bible, turned to Genesis, the chapter of beginnings. A symbolic detail, but to a Mason, it's unmistakable. America had just been initiated through a Masonic rite of origin. Some records even claim that when Washington finished his oath, he bowed his head and quietly added the phrase, "So help me God," a phrase commonly heard in Masonic initiation ceremonies, though not required by the U.S. Constitution. You might say, perhaps it was just coincidence. But then you learn that Washington personally presided over the largest Masonic ceremonies of his time, that he wore the apron, donned the gloves, poured the wine, and scattered the grain during the cornerstone laying ceremony of the United States Capitol, an ancient Freemasonry ritual symbolizing the founding of a new order. And perhaps most telling of all, it was Washington himself who allowed the Masonic lodges to continue operating publicly after the Revolution, even though no law required him to do so. He remained silent on the matter, letting them exist as a parallel structure to government, so long as they served the interests of the Republic. So now we must ask the uncomfortable question. George Washington, the father of the nation, in that sacred moment, who was he really swearing his oath to? To the people, of course. But he had also taken oaths years earlier inside a lodge before brothers who called one another by coded names. And in the Masonic system, an oath is never taken lightly. Once sworn, it is eternal. Perhaps that is why Washington refused a crown, why he declined a third term, why he walked away from personal glory, not simply out of humility, but because he had already pledged himself to a greater construction project, what Masons call the Temple of Reason. And if that's true, then America, from the very moment of its birth, was never just a nation. It was a grand lodge where every citizen was a potential builder, and every law a brick in a structure that remains unfinished to this day. It's a different way of seeing things. One you won't find in textbooks, but once you've seen it, you can never unsee it. George Washington took his oath before the people, but he had also sworn an oath inside the lodge, where there were no cameras, no transcripts, only silence and symbols. And when the head of a nation is also the ritual leader of a secret society, we have to ask ourselves, was the lodge just a meeting place, or was it the true command center behind the revolution? In the days before a nation was born, when there was no Department of Defense, no centralized intelligence agency, no formal structure to coordinate war across 13 colonies, who was really in charge? The answer may lie behind closed doors, in meetings with no minutes, no recordings, but a strict hierarchy and flawless order, the Masonic lodges. Between 1775 and 1783, chaos reigned. The colonies still functioned almost independently. Washington's Continental Army was young, poorly equipped, and deeply divided, by politics, by religion, by conflicting goals, and yet one thing held it together: a secret fraternity. Freemasonry wasn't a military force, but that was its strength. It wasn't bound by territory. It didn't need licenses or legal recognition. It couldn't be censored by Congress or exposed by the enemy, because no one could prove that a lodge meeting was an act of treason. And yet lodges had everything that a fledgling government lacked: a federal network, stretching from Boston to Charleston, from Philadelphia to New York. A system of signs, codes, and recognition rituals, no tech required, yet incredibly effective across regions. Local leadership loyal to a higher order, like decentralized command units. And most crucial of all, a foundation of absolute trust between brothers. Something even the Continental Congress had not fully achieved. Between 1776 and 1781, many historians have noted a strange pattern. Military strategy appeared unusually synchronized between colonies, despite Congress having little binding authority. How did forces from Massachusetts coordinate so seamlessly with those from Virginia when they followed different laws, had no shared command, and often no direct communication? A bold theory emerged: many top commanders were Masons, and they exchanged strategic information within the lodge far beyond the reach of any government official. Just consider George Washington, Master Mason; Henry Knox, Mason; Nathaniel Greene, Mason; Israel Putnam, Joseph Warren, John Sullivan, all Masons. On the battlefield, they may have disagreed politically, but inside the lodge they stood as equals. They called one another brother and pledged their loyalty to something higher than any nation, a shared order. You could call it coincidence. But coincidence doesn't explain why so many intricate plans were never intercepted by the British at a time when there were no telegraphs, no phones, no encrypted messages. So who passed the intelligence, who drew the maps, who coordinated the moves? The lodge wasn't just a place for philosophy. It was a space with the people, the trust, and the structure to act. And once an oath was made, members were willing to risk everything to protect the common construction. If that's true, then Freemasonry wasn't just a spiritual army. It may have been the underground command center of the entire revolution, operating more effectively than any government agency at the time. So what do we call it? A secret society, a command system, or the true heart of the uprising? If the lodges were the hidden brain coordinating the revolution, then they needed a nervous system, a way to transmit signals quickly, accurately, and without a trace. And the secret fraternity had just that. Long before anyone imagined the telegraph or military intelligence, no maps, no passwords barked across the battlefield, just signs, oaths, and couriers without names, recognized instantly wherever they went. Before Morse code, before telegrams, before the United States had a single intelligence agency, there already existed a fast, reliable, and unbreakable system of communication. No wires, no encryption, no official documentation. It ran on something deceptively simple: recognition between two people by a single handshake. This was the Masonic network, and it may have been one of the first covert communication systems of the American Revolution. Freemasonry didn't operate like a military unit. They had no formal ranks, no clerks taking notes, no paperwork left behind. But what they had was what every intelligence network dreams of: passwords, symbols, silent signals, and, most critically, anonymous couriers wearing no uniforms, holding no rank, yet able to pass freely, with support at every stop. A Mason could cross through multiple colonies without carrying any documents. If caught, he had nothing that could be used against him. But if he reached a lodge in a town where he needed to be, all it took was a chalked symbol on a wooden table, a head tilt at just the right angle, or a special greeting, and he would be recognized and trusted, no questions asked, because every man there had sworn the same oath at the start of his journey, an oath stronger than any government contract: do not betray, do not reveal, do not ask why, just act. This explains why, throughout the Revolutionary War, the British repeatedly failed to disrupt communication between rebel forces. It wasn't because the Americans had better technology; they had no technology. What they had were lodges, safe houses for messengers who didn't write, didn't speak. They simply arrived at the right place at the right time. From Massachusetts to Pennsylvania, from Virginia to South Carolina, lodges functioned like living relay stations, places where news of British troop movements, arms stockpiles, or orders from Washington himself could be passed along without a trace. And if anyone ever wondered, how did militias seem to know troop movements before official word arrived? How did ambushes get set up before orders were even issued? The answer might lie not in a general's tent, but in a craftsman, a tavern keeper, or a wandering doctor, someone who had once knelt before a Masonic altar and sworn his oath in silence. Some evidence even suggests that Masonic couriers infiltrated the British ranks using universal lodge signals shared across both sides, because there were Masons on both the American and British sides, and when those symbols were used at just the right moment, they could allow a patriot to walk through enemy lines undetected. A double-edged sword, but wielded with masterful precision. You won't find their names in the history books, no medals, no statues, no official recognition. But without them, battles would have failed. Orders would have never been delivered, and critical decisions might never have reached the right hands in time to make a difference. When war called for speed, they sent nameless men. When the age demanded wisdom, they sent someone with a pen. Not everyone carried a rifle. Some carried a pen. And in the world of secret societies, a book isn't always written to persuade the masses. Sometimes it's written to awaken those who've taken an oath. Thomas Paine was one of those men, and the Age of Reason wasn't just a declaration, it was a cipher. Thomas Paine, a familiar name in American history, a voice of reason in the storm of revolution. His work, Common Sense, inspired tens of thousands to rise against British monarchy. But the book that truly terrified religious authorities wasn't Common Sense, it was another one, The Age of Reason. Released while Europe still trembled in the shadow of the Church, this book didn't just attack organized religion, it called on humanity to return to reason as the only source of light. Paine wrote, "My religion is to do good." He rejected theology, denied divine authority, and boldly declared, "My God does not write books." Clergy called it blasphemy. But inside Freemason lodges, the Age of Reason passed from hand to hand like a secret document, an unofficial manifesto of Masonic philosophy, written not in code, but in words with two layers of meaning. Read it closely, and you'll see that Paine wasn't calling for the destruction of spirituality. Quite the opposite. He believed in a great creator, a phrase echoed in Masonic rituals, where God isn't defined by scripture or shape, but as the great architect of the universe, the one who designed the laws of reason, balance, and order. Paine was never officially confirmed as a Mason, but his writings are filled with unmistakable Masonic themes. He called reason the true light that guides mankind. In Masonry, light is the second degree after one is initiated. He emphasized individual liberty rooted in morality, aligned with Masonry's belief in self-construction. He used the term natural order, the foundational concept of an ideal society in every lodge. Paine also lived in France, where he was closely connected with prominent Masons involved in the French Revolution, many of them friends of Benjamin Franklin, Grand Master of the Paris Lodge. In the political salons of the 18th century, revolutionaries didn't just plot to overthrow kings, they dreamed of a new world where Masonic ideals replaced both thrones and pulpits. The Age of Reason was born in that world, a book not meant for the superstitious crowd, but written for the awakened, for those who had once stood in the lodge, sworn sacred oaths by candlelight, and understood that morality, not dogma, is the true foundation of freedom. That's why the book was fiercely condemned by religious institutions, but quietly passed along among intellectuals, military officers, and especially Masons. Many in that era didn't understand what Paine was really saying, but those who had received the light knew. The Age of Reason was never a call to rebellion. It was a coded message, a whispered truth meant only for those who knew how to listen. Thomas Paine wrote with reason. But some men didn't just write, they lived and died for the ideals they believed in. In the shadow of Bunker Hill, while gunfire still echoed and no flag had yet been raised, one Mason fell like a soldier and was buried like an unknown. But in the world of the secret fraternity, his name was never forgotten. Joseph Warren, a silent symbol of loyalty at a time when history hadn't yet decided who to remember. His name doesn't appear on currency. There is no national monument bearing his face. American children don't learn his story in school. But in Masonic lodges across Boston, New England, and beyond, Joseph Warren is spoken of with almost sacred reverence. He wasn't just a physician, a political activist, a general in the colonial militia. He was a Mason, and he died keeping his oath. On June 17, 1775, the Battle of Bunker Hill erupted. British troops marched on Charlestown in overwhelming numbers. The American rebels, mostly untrained militia, took cover behind makeshift fortifications. Joseph Warren had just been appointed a general, but he had not yet assumed command. He could have stayed behind, observed, given orders from safety, but he didn't. He stepped onto the front lines, shouldered a musket, and fought as a common soldier until he fell like a warrior. His body was later identified by British officers. And because Warren had been a prominent political leader in Massachusetts, they deliberately desecrated his remains as a warning to others. He was dumped in a shallow grave, no funeral, no honors, no flag. To official history, that was the end of his story. A promising figure lost too early, overshadowed by names like Washington or Adams. But to the Masonic lodges, that was only the beginning. Warren had been a core member of St. Andrew's Lodge in Boston, one of the most critical lodges in the pre-revolutionary years. He wasn't just a Mason, he had served as Grand Master of the local Grand Lodge, a title reserved only for men of real influence and trust within the community. When news of his death reached the lodges, memorial rituals began, not once, but every year. For decades, lodges across Massachusetts held silent ceremonies in his honor, commemorating the brother who died while fulfilling the vow to serve a higher order beyond oneself. Even in 1825, 50 years after his death, Marquis de Lafayette, the French hero of both the American and French revolutions, visited Warren's grave in Boston. He knelt, took a handful of earth, and said, "This is the soil of a great man." It was not a political gesture, it was a deeply symbolic act, and quite possibly a Masonic rite. So why is Joseph Warren not honored more widely like other founding fathers? Perhaps because he died too soon, before he had the chance to sign the documents that would immortalize others. Or perhaps because his true role lay within a network history doesn't dare name: Freemasonry. A man standing at the intersection of medicine, politics, warfare, and secret fraternity, and who gave his life at the very moment history needed silence more than celebration. But to the Mason, he's never forgotten. Each year, on June 17th, in lodges across Massachusetts, a candle is lit. His name is not shouted, but in the soft glow of the lodge they remember. There are heroes who need no statues. They have oaths, and a permanent place in the quiet memory of those who know how to look beyond the veil of history. Joseph Warren fell before the United States was even born. But his brothers in the lodge continued the journey. And when the smoke of war finally cleared, they didn't just rebuild a nation, they began drafting the first blueprint for a new order. The Constitution was written, it's not just by statesmen, but by men who had once sworn oaths in silence, by candlelight, to an ideal that reached beyond even the Republic itself. So we must ask, who really wrote the US Constitution, and what did they place inside it that we still haven't fully seen? The US Constitution, appraised as the pinnacle of democratic thought, transparency, and rule of law. But few realize that many of its framers were deeply connected to a secret fraternity that had existed long before America did: Freemasonry. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 took place in Philadelphia. Inside Independence Hall, 55 delegates from 12 states gathered over several months to reimagine the foundation of a new nation. But the people in that room weren't just politicians, lawyers, or slaveholders. An astonishing number were high-ranking Masons. George Washington, who presided over the convention, was a master Mason. Benjamin Franklin, the oldest and arguably most influential delegate, was a Grand Master in France. John Blair, Gunning Bedford Jr., Daniel Carroll, James McHenry, all documented Masons. Some estimates suggest that at least 1/3 of the Constitution's framers were either Freemasons or closely tied to local lodges. So what did they carry from the lodge into the Constitution? Not rituals, not coded symbols, but a way of thinking, a structure, a deep-rooted philosophy that sees man as a builder of reason, where society is not divinely ordained, but designed like an intricate structure, layered, balanced, and governed by principles. The three branches of government, legislative, executive, and judicial, mirror the three pillars of Masonic architecture: wisdom, strength, and beauty. The separation of powers and mutual oversight reflect the degree system within Masonry: entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master Mason, each with its own boundaries, rituals, and truths, and none allowed to progress without being enlightened. Even the opening words, "We the people," sound democratic, but echo a Masonic ideal. Every person is a rough stone, to be shaped and polished until they fit as a perfect piece of a greater architectural whole. Franklin once wrote, "No man was ever born perfect, but every man can be shaped." In the lodge, this was a sacred truth. In the Constitution, it became the foundation of citizenship, not as subjects of a crown, but as builders of a nation. Even the geographic layout of the Capitol, with the Capitol at the center, the Supreme Court to the east, the White House to the west, mirrors the traditional layout of a Masonic lodge, where the worshipful master, senior warden, and junior warden sit at three cardinal points, forming a triangle of energy, the symbolic seat of light, order, and reason. So, Was the Constitution simply the result of political compromise? Or was it the culmination of centuries of Masonic thought, passed down through whispered tradition, refined through ritual, and, finally, etched onto paper as a blueprint too sacred to name? That's why when modern Americans read the Constitution, they see a democratic document. But when a Mason reads it, they may see something more, a blueprint, the foundation plan for a grand lodge called the United States of America. If the Constitution was the spiritual blueprint of America, then the Capitol building is its physical manifestation. It's not just where lawmakers meet, it's the architectural reflection of the entire philosophy of the United States. It is the United States Capitol, the heart of legislative power in America. But here's the strange part. The laying of its cornerstone wasn't a civil event. It was a Masonic ritual. On September 18, 1793, George Washington, by then president, arrived at an empty hill on the eastern edge of the newly founded capital, Washington, D.C. But he wasn't in military uniform. He wore a Masonic apron, white gloves, and was accompanied by a full procession of local lodges. They conducted an ancient ceremony, scattering grain, pouring wine, and anointing with oil, symbols of prosperity, peace, and illumination. The ritual is well documented in Freemason records, but here's what's more telling. There is no record of any U.S. government objection, no replacement ceremony. It was accepted as a natural part of laying the foundation of democracy. And from that ritual, a building rose, not just made of stone and marble, but of symbols. The original Capitol building, with its domed rotunda east-facing front and stairways climbing toward the sunrise, resembles an ancient Greek temple, a place where one ascends toward light. That wasn't by accident. In Masonic architecture, the east is the direction of intellectual light, where the worshipful master presides over the lodge. The Capitol's three-part structure, central dome, east and west wings, reflects the three pillars of Masonry: wisdom, strength, and beauty. Even the interior details and the high ceilings, the circular forms, the chandelier hanging at the center, create a space of perfect geometric balance, what Masons call the inner light of geometry. But here's what's truly astonishing. The original design of the Capitol wasn't submitted by a government architect. It was proposed by William Thornton, not just an architect, but a master mason. Thornton won the competition with a neoclassical design, but if you flip through the drawings, you'll notice something. The axes, proportions, and layout echo the structure of an English-style ritual lodge, scaled up to the size of a city. And the Capitol does not stand alone. It is aligned along axes with the White House, the Supreme Court, and the Washington Monument. These roads and sight lines, when drawn as straight lines, form familiar Masonic shapes: compass, square, five-pointed star, equilateral triangle. Some alignments even appear at a 23.5-degree tilt, matching the axial tilt of the Earth. Coincidence? Or was someone embedding a symbolic map in the heart of the Capitol, as if to say, we didn't just build this nation, we shaped how it would see the universe? Some call it art, some call it faith. But for those who've ever stood inside a Masonic lodge, they understand architecture is a language, and when words can't be spoken, shapes speak truths no one wants to hear out loud. And if that's true, then the Capitol, often hailed as the beating heart of modern democracy, may also be an eternal ritual in stone, where the oaths of invisible builders have been etched deeper than any constitution ever written. If the Capitol building is the cornerstone, then all of Washington, D.C. is the map built around it, a lodge no longer confined to a small chamber, but stretched across avenues, parks, and monuments. as if someone had taken a sacred blueprint and expanded it to the scale of a nation. And when we step back far enough to see the full picture, the question becomes clearer than ever. Could it be that America's capital is not just a political center, but an encrypted symbol? A capital city is meant to hold the center of power. But Washington, D.C. is unlike any other. It didn't grow from an ancient city like Paris. It didn't evolve organically like London. It was designed from scratch by a group of men with blueprints, compasses, and a vision that reached beyond ordinary politics. In 1791, Pierre Charles L'Enfant, a French-born architect, was appointed by George Washington to design the new capital. But L'Enfant didn't work alone. He was advised and supported by members of the provisional government, many of whom were high-ranking Masons, and from the very first drafts, Washington, D.C. bore strange, unexplained features, avenues intersecting to form 5-pointed stars. Primary roads aligned exactly with the east-west axis. The empty spaces between government buildings forming equilateral triangles, hexagrams, even the iconic compass and square symbols. When you connect the dots on a map, coincidence? No one said it aloud, but original blueprints clearly show the Capitol, the White House, the Washington Monument, and the city's major plazas were not randomly placed. They were positioned so that when viewed from above, they formed a gigantic symbolic map, invisible at street level, but undeniable from the sky. A lodge in the open. Take the Washington Monument, for example, a towering 555-foot obelisk centered on the Capitol Lincoln Memorial axis. Its shape mirrors that of ancient Egyptian obelisks, symbols of the sun, ascension, and masculine force, a central image in many Masonic rituals. Even the lighting of the monument at night is calculated, so that each New Year's sunrise casts a shadow directly eastward, toward where the master would traditionally sit in a Masonic lodge. The city's layout is divided into 4 quadrants: northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest, mirroring the way lodges divide their meeting chambers by the 4 sacred directions: earth, water, air, fire. Some researchers suggest that if you overlay the map of a ceremonial lodge onto the city plan of D.C., you'll find that key lodge points align precisely with the city's most powerful buildings: the Capitol, the White House, the Supreme Court, the Treasury. One fascinating detail: the angle between Pennsylvania Avenue, linking the Capitol and White House, and Maryland Avenue is exactly 66.6 degrees. A number long debated in Masonic symbology, with layers of mystical meaning that have sparked centuries of speculation. So what is Washington, D.C. really? A city of democracy or a city of symbols? We can't say for certain, but we also can't deny this. Nowhere else in the world does Masonic symbolism appear as clearly, as densely, or as deliberately as it does in Washington, D.C. Not just on the buildings, but in the roads, the parks, even the placement of street lamps. And perhaps it's no coincidence that George Washington himself, a Grand Master Mason, was the one who chose this land, presided over the cornerstone ceremony, and passed down the builder's will to future generations through a city he never lived to see completed, but one that bears his silent imprint forever. Washington, D.C. may function as a political capital, but to those who know how to look, it is also the quiet blueprint of a grand lodge built not to be hidden, but to stand in plain daylight, unnoticed by the uninitiated. Once the city was built as a symbolic map, once halls of power were infused with geometry and ritual, one might assume the secret society had fulfilled its mission. But for Freemasonry, completing a structure is only the beginning. And as the United States entered an era of peace, a quiet question began to emerge. Would the fraternity now retreat into the shadows, or begin to control the light? Logically, one might expect them to disband. or at the very least, withdraw. But that didn't happen. Instead, Freemasonry didn't disappear. It expanded. No longer confined to Boston tavern basements, Masonic lodges now rose across the growing republic. From Philadelphia to New Orleans, from Virginia to Kentucky, every major city had at least one publicly visible lodge, complete with buildings, signs, and spokesmen. They no longer needed to hide, because now many of those running the new government were Masons themselves. George Washington remained connected to his lodge until the end of his life. James Monroe, a Mason. Andrew Jackson, a Mason. Across the states, governors, mayors, judges entered lodges not merely for social prestige, but as an initiation into a parallel structure of influence. Freemasonry didn't seize power. They didn't form political parties. They didn't run for office. But they were present at every level of the new power hierarchy, like a hidden foundation no one sees, yet holding the entire structure above it. In 1799, just a few years after Washington's death, the Grand Lodge of England recorded, "The spread of Masonry across the Americas has exceeded all expectation." Not as an organization, but as a wave, at the spirit of a new era. Why? Because in a time of chaos, Masonry offered order. In a time of war, they created unity. And in a time of peace, they provided something else, a standard. In a land with no aristocracy, no royal traditions, no state church, the lodge became one of the few places that preserved hierarchy, ritual, and belief in a higher order beyond the individual. Freemasonry didn't dissolve, they changed fronts from the basements of secrecy into legislative chambers, from the flicker of ceremonial candlelight into the glow of government buildings, from oaths of war to whispers beside lawmakers and treasurers, and so began a new chapter. No longer a secret society of wartime, but a quiet system of influence in peacetime. As they no longer needed to hide, they moved silently into new seats of power, not through political slogans, but through personal influence and a network of trust forged during the Revolution. They were present in Congress, in governors' offices, and more importantly, in the one branch of power where no election is needed, the judiciary. And there, a new question arose. How many of the first Supreme Court justices were Masons, and just how far did their influence reach? When the U.S. government officially began operating in 1789, Congress and the President took center stage. But in a quieter corner, away from the noise, the elections, and the spotlight, another institution was born, one that would wield supreme power over constitutional disputes for centuries to come, the Supreme Court. And just like the other branches of government, Freemasonry was not absent. John Jay, the first Chief Justice, had no confirmed Masonic record, but his successor did. John Marshall, and the longest-serving Chief Justice in U.S. history, the man who laid the foundation of modern judicial power, was a master Mason. Marshall had served as an officer in the Continental Army, fought alongside George Washington, and was a member of Richmond Lodge No. 13 in Virginia. He wasn't merely a participant, and he presided over numerous lodge ceremonies after the war, including the initiation of high-level political figures. So the question arises, did Masonic influence shape legal decisions? The answer isn't easy to measure. But look closely at how Marshall governed the court, and you'll see Masonic pillars clearly reflected, a belief in universal law, echoing Masonry's reverence for cosmic order, elevating the Constitution to the highest authority, much like the sacred ritual texts seen as unbreakable light within a lodge. Most notably, the emphasis on checks and balances between branches, what Masons refer to as balance and harmony, the equilibrium of wisdom, virtue, and action. In the court's first 2 decades, at least 3 justices were confirmed Masons: John Marshall, Bushrod Washington, George Washington's nephew, and William Johnson. It's likely others were affiliated with local lodges, but never left a paper trail. In true Masonic tradition, No need for recognition. But Masonry's role in the judiciary wasn't just about who they were, it was about how they thought. Freemasonry is a world of ritual, order, and philosophical reflection, where every word, every gesture is weighed like evidence in a courtroom. So when Masons stepped into the American legal system, they brought with them an ancient mental framework. Never judge in haste, never act from emotion. Always seek the light, the truth, between opposing extremes. This explains why many of the court's earliest decisions didn't favor unchecked executive power, but instead reinforced equilibrium between branches, just like in a lodge. No man holds absolute authority. All must answer to the rule of law, the foundational stone that no one may break. Thus, the judiciary wasn't where Freemasonry launched a revolution. It was where they guarded the architecture of revolution in silence. While politics stirred, while administrations rose and fell, the courts remained. The Masons' stone column at the center of the American temple, unshaken. When Freemasons entered the Supreme Court, they didn't just carry legal knowledge, they carried a worldview, a sense of structure, a devotion to symbols. Because in Masonry, not everything must be spoken aloud. Some truths are best engraved in stone. And while the court preserved the legal framework, it was the national symbols, carefully chosen, that may represent the Masons' most permanent message. So now we must ask, the eye on the dollar, who is it really watching? And the Great Seals, is it just a symbol, or the encoded signature of an order that never declares its name? You hold a US dollar bill every day. You trade it. You store it. You spend it. But have you ever stopped to really look at it? Because on the back of the Great Seal of the United States, there are details that are far from accidental. An unfinished pyramid, a single radiant eye hovering above it, and a Latin phrase from antiquity, Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order of the ages. The question is, why this symbol? Why not an image of freedom, justice, or the people? Why a pyramid, an ancient emblem of mystical Egypt with no direct connection to American history? And why is the top of the pyramid floating, detached, leaving a gap between the foundation and the eye? To answer that, we must go back to 1782, when the Continental Congress officially approved the seal's design. 3 separate committees had offered different proposals. In the final group, including Charles Thomson, William Barton, and most notably Benjamin Franklin, a Grand Master of the Masonic Lodge in France, the pyramid appeared for the first time. No one ever publicly explained why. But in Masonic ritual, the pyramid represents a work in progress, an ideal structure humanity is still striving to complete. The detached capstone is a declaration. The order is unfinished. And the eye above, the eye of providence, is a widely recognized Masonic symbol representing the great architect of the universe, watching over the actions of Earth's builders. The Latin phrase below is even more revealing, Novus Ordo Seclorum, not a slogan of the French or English revolutions, but a term widely used in Masonic circles of the time to refer to a rational order, a new structure not built on monarchy or divine right, but on human design, reason, and hierarchy. A new order, but new in what sense? A freer society, or one constructed by a secretive fraternity, complete with levels, symbols, and oaths that no outsider is ever meant to understand? Even the pyramid's 13-step. They match the original 13 colonies, yes, but also carry sacred meaning in Masonry, symbolizing transformation, death, and rebirth. And on the eagle's side of the seal, above its head, is a 6-pointed star formed by 13 smaller stars. A figure some interpret as the Seal of Solomon, an ancient symbol found in Masonic rituals dating back to the 1600s. All of this could be coincidence. But if you believe that a group of men designed Washington, D.C., using Masonic blueprints, laid the Capitol's cornerstone in a Masonic ceremony, and wrote the Constitution infused with Masonic philosophy, then the idea that they chose the Great Seal simply because it looked nice becomes highly unlikely. When a national symbol begins to resemble a coded message, the real question isn't where were they present, but rather, what were they doing behind the major events of history? And just a few decades after the US gained its independence, another war erupted. But this time, it wasn't against a distant monarchy, it was between former allies. In the shadow of the War of 1812, the fraternity remained. But who were they now, comrades, or a third force, fighting not for a flag but for an order? 1812. The United States, now an independent nation, returned to the battlefield, but this time it wasn't fighting colonial rule. It was fighting its former sovereign, the British Empire. According to official history, the War of 1812 was about freedom of navigation, national honor, and control of Western territories. But beneath those surface-level justifications, there was another layer, a layer few dare to mention, the parallel presence of Freemasonry on both sides of the war. America had Freemasons, but so did Britain. On the battlefields of 1812, two lodge systems operated simultaneously. One under the United Grand Lodge of England, the other under the independent Grand Lodges of America. So what happened when brothers of the same ritual tradition faced each other across enemy lines? There are scattered records suggesting that in certain cases, when British and American officers recognized one another as Masons, they quietly postponed engagements or even released prisoners of war. Without involving official channels, these actions didn't come from governments. They came from a silent code between lodge members. In theory, Freemasonry is non-political, but that's exactly why it can operate outside the battlefield as a third force, fighting not for a flag, but for the continuity of an order that transcends national borders. Why does this matter? Because the War of 1812 wasn't just a conflict of guns and treaties, it was a clash between two versions of Freemasonry. On one side, the British model, loyal to the Grand Lodge in London, structured, hierarchical, and closely aligned with royal influence. On the other, the American Masonic experiment, independent, adaptable, rooted in Republican values and individual liberty. This war may have served as the final split between the Old World Masonic lineage and the emerging self-governing network of American lodges. And yet, something strange happened. After the war, as the US rebuilt and expanded, the number of Masonic lodges didn't shrink, it skyrocketed. From New York to Ohio, Louisiana to Indiana, hundreds of new lodges appeared, as if the war had become a catalyst for restructuring and expanding a silent order, cloaked in the language of freedom. Freemasons made no public claims about their role in the War of 1812. But what followed, the lodge expansion, the seamless integration of members into Congress, courts, and the military, reveals a quiet truth. Freemasonry didn't retreat after the war. It expanded, it sank deeper into the foundations of American power, still behind the veil. But that very silence began to stir unease, because when a group never claims power but always seems to appear where power resides, eventually the public no longer sees them as brothers. They begin to see them as a threat. There was a time when Freemasonry stood as a symbol of idealism, intellect, and nation-building. But as the 19th century dawned, that image began to crack. And then, within the span of just one short decade, the secret society that once stood behind the Founding Fathers became the target of public condemnation. What happened? It wasn't the revelation of a grand conspiracy. It wasn't a failed coup. It was A name, William Morgan. In 1826, Morgan, who claimed to be a former Mason in New York, announced his plan to publish a book exposing the inner rituals, codes, and secrets of the fraternity. Before the book could be released, he vanished. No body, no trial, no explanation. Only one fact was known. He had been detained by local Masons and was never seen again. This incident sparked the first anti-Masonic wave in American history. The public was outraged. Newspapers denounced the fraternity. Preachers warned that Freemasonry was a nation within a nation, a dark force masquerading as justice and morality. For the first time ever, an organized opposition emerged, the Anti-Masonic Party, the first third party in American political history. They didn't just protest, they ran candidates, held conventions, and lobbied Congress, with a singular mission to dismantle the influence of Freemasonry. Why such an extreme reaction? Because, in a fragile young republic, the idea of a secret society with its own rules, its own oaths, and power beyond the law was intolerable. Freemasonry, once quiet in wartime and discreet in revolution, was dragged into the spotlight. And that spotlight was no longer kind. In some states, lodges were forced to shut down. Politicians publicly resigned from the fraternity. Former members were ostracized. Ceremonies moved deeper into secrecy and ceased altogether. Freemasonry didn't collapse, but it was pushed back into the shadows where it had once begun. And yet something even stranger happened. Despite open hostility, Freemasonry said nothing. No public rebuttals, no counter-campaigns, no appearances in defense. They stayed silent, just as they had for centuries. No defense, no explanation, just continue. And that silence only intensified the fear, because an enemy who speaks can be challenged, but a secret society that keeps operating, even after being cast out by the entire political system? Then the question is no longer why they were attacked, but rather, why, after everything, did they survive? They were condemned, they were cast out, they were pushed away from political power, but the Brotherhood did not disappear. They simply stepped back, quietly. And in that darkness, Freemasonry began doing what it does best, not fighting through noise, but through influence. Because soon America would stop shunning the Brotherhood. On the contrary, power would start coming to the lodge, as if it were a quiet rite of passage. No one forced it, but everyone followed. And Freemasonry, once denounced as a dangerous force, slowly became a kind of soft state religion for the American ruling class. No nation has ever declared Freemasonry as its official religion. But throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries in the United States, something extraordinary began to unfold. The men who rose to the highest levels of power, presidents, judges, generals, governors, were, more often than not, also men who had stepped into the lodge. There were no laws requiring it, no formal invitations. And yet Freemasonry quietly became a silent rite of passage, a soft threshold one had to cross to truly understand how the system worked from the inside. After the wave of public backlash following the William Morgan affair, the Brotherhood didn't fight back. They didn't wage a public battle. Instead, they chose the oldest strategy: to rise from beneath. In small towns across the country, the lodges stayed open. There, the mayor, the sheriff, the banker, the lawyer, the doctor, all gathered regularly, not as officials, not as partisans, but as brothers. No party lines, no slogans, just oaths, rituals, and a structure that quietly forged an unofficial yet unbreakable network. By the end of the 19th century, unofficial estimates showed over 60% of U.S. governors were Freemasons. Nearly half of all state Supreme Court justices had ties to the lodge, and most notably, 7 out of the next 10 U.S. presidents after Washington had direct or indirect connections to Freemasonry. William McKinley, Mason. Theodore Roosevelt, Mason. Franklin D. Roosevelt, Mason. Harry S. Truman, not just president, but also Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Missouri. Why did they join? No one could say for certain. No one was forced, but somehow everyone went. Because the lodge wasn't just a place of initiation, it was a school of leadership. In the lodge, one learned how to speak slowly, clearly, solemnly, how to stay silent, the right time, how to operate within a system of hierarchy where no one skipped ranks and every ounce of authority came wrapped in ritual. Over time, Freemasonry ceased to be a mystery to the elite. It became a quiet starting point for those who wanted to go deeper. It wasn't mandatory, but if you didn't enter the lodge, you'd always remain just outside the real game. The press of that era began calling the Brotherhood by many names: the second government, the parallel power. But the most common phrase came from insiders themselves: the soft state religion. No churches, but rituals. No Bible, but lodge laws. No priests, but thousands of men quietly devoted to the light of reason and living by it. This wasn't hard power, this was foundational power. The kind that never shows up on television, isn't written in any constitution, but is present in every closed room where major decisions are made. And so people began to understand Freemasonry didn't need to seize the nation by force. All it had to do was set the standard and watch as every person in power willingly adhered to it. As Freemasonry became the silent standard of influence, entering the lodge no longer felt optional. It became something of a second birth for those who wanted to rise further. And by the 20th century, this pattern extended far beyond politics, into the military, intelligence, and the centers of global power. Generals, presidents, strategists, before they commanded the fate of the world, they once knelt before candlelight, took a vow in silence, and stepped through a door with no name. The 20th century is remembered for war, crisis, and decisions that reshaped the world. But while history records the names of presidents, generals, and world leaders, few have noticed that many of them, before they became national icons, were members of an organization never mentioned in the Constitution: Freemasonry. This was not a coincidence. It was a pattern, subtle, consistent, and repeated across generations of leadership. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the wartime president of World War II, a Mason. Harry S. Truman, the man who ordered the atomic bomb, not just a president, but also Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Missouri. Douglas MacArthur, legendary commander of the Pacific Theater, a Mason. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI for nearly 50 years, holding America's domestic intelligence network in his hands, a Mason. And they weren't just casual members. Many of them participated in private rituals held far from the public eye. No media, no official records. Just symbols, oaths, and unwritten looks. Why would the most powerful men in the world step into an ancient organization with no army, no budget, no voters? The answer lies in what Freemasonry offered: a space where power is stripped of politics and returned to symbolic structure, where every decision must balance between wisdom, ethics, and order. Inside the lodge, a president is not a president. A general wears no rank. Everyone is simply a brother. And it is precisely this artificial equality that gave the powerful a rare sense of safety. But because of that, Masonic initiations in the 20th century became increasingly secretive. The public had begun to suspect, the press had begun to investigate, and the more powerful the lodge became, the harder it was to maintain the illusion of being apolitical. So the ceremonies moved behind closed doors, inside state capitals, the private homes of Grand Masters, even, according to some rumors, inside military bases or restricted government facilities. No announcements, no cameras, only whispered recollections or internal records never meant to see the light of day. There were rumors that some Cold War decisions were first floated within the lodge, that presidents in waiting were privately morally evaluated before entering the White House, that closed-door meetings between world leaders began from Masonic ties spanning nations. No one confirmed these things, and no one denied them, because the Brotherhood doesn't operate like a conventional institution. They don't control power. They shape how the powerful think, speak, and act. It's not brute force. It's ritual power, where a major decision might begin not with a vote, but with an oath whispered by candlelight. When the most powerful men of the 20th century stepped into the lodge, they didn't just join a tradition. They entered a structure that had survived for centuries without ever collapsing. And while presidents and generals eventually fade from office, something remains. A quiet force that operates, connects, and restructures without ever needing to stand in the spotlight. So today the question is no longer, who was a Mason? It is, who now holds the keys to that entire system? For more than 3 centuries, Freemasonry has had no president, no supreme commander, no written constitution declaring its ultimate authority. And that is exactly what makes the question so difficult. Who is really coordinating this network? Who makes the decisions? Who chooses who gets in and who stays out? When we speak of power, we usually imagine clear offices, official titles, and visible chains of command. But Freemasonry doesn't operate that way. Its system functions more like a network of veins, flowing just beneath the skin of global power. Each country has its own Grand Lodge. Each US state has its own Grand Lodge. But behind all of them lies a web of international connections, not publicly declared, yet quietly maintained by high-level representatives from each lodge. There is no leader of world Freemasonry, but in every generation certain individuals emerge, known quietly as the ones holding the keys. Not through elections, but through respect, personal influence, and the ability to preserve the lodge's structure according to ancient tradition. Take, for example, the early 20th century. Albert Pike, a legendary figure in American Freemasonry, was widely seen as the spiritual architect of the entire Southern Masonic system. He held no executive office, yet every major decision passed through him, from philosophical doctrine to degrees of initiation. His book, Morals and Dogma, became the spiritual blueprint for countless Anglo-Saxon lodges around the world. In the modern era, this role hasn't disappeared. It's simply gone deeper underground. Across the US, many state Grand Masters now act like silent archbishops, overseeing initiations, passing on ritual knowledge, and ensuring each lodge stays true to its ancient standards. Some of these individuals, never mentioned in media, are known within the network by a quiet title: the silent architects. They don't make public policy. They don't preach. They do one thing only: they maintain the structure, so that those in power, whether politicians, generals, or billionaires, must all enter properly, swear the correct oath, and adhere to the same principles. What kind of power is this? Not the power to rule, but the power to preserve. You'll never see it, but if they let go, the whole thing collapses, perfect, because no one else knows how to hold it together. Today, lodges still operate across America and the world. The rituals continue. The initiations continue. The succession continues. But it has all grown quieter, smaller, more discreet. Not because it has weakened, but because it has blended so deeply into the architecture of modern power, you can no longer tell where government ends and where the lodge begins. And so the old question returns, but this time with a sharper edge. Who really controls power in this age? A government? An international body? Or a network that's existed for centuries and still operates, even if its name appears nowhere at all, from a faint symbol on the Declaration of Independence to secret rituals behind 20th century war rooms. Freemasonry doesn't appear as a separate institution, but rather as the foundation beneath the entire structure of the American system. You could say it's all coincidence, that the triangles in government buildings are just aesthetic, that the presidents who were Masons simply joined because everyone did back then, that the eye on the dollar bill isn't watching anyone, that the unfinished pyramid was simply never fully drawn. You could absolutely believe all of that. But if history has taught us anything, it's this. Real power is never loud. It doesn't need to win elections. It doesn't need to appear on the evening news. It only needs to be present, where decisions are made, and turn those decisions into unspoken default. When people hear the word Freemasonry, they often think of America, a country where its symbols appear openly from paper currency to the Capitol building. But the truth is, this secretive order didn't begin in America, and it never truly belonged to just one nation. Freemasonry is a global network. Its roots stretch deep into Europe, and its branches have extended across continents, from Britain, France, and Germany to colonies in Asia, Africa, and South America. So the question is, in the modern world, does Freemasonry still carry the spirit of those idealistic builders from the American Revolution? Or has it evolved into something else, quieter, harder to recognize, present everywhere, yet belonging nowhere? In England, the Grand Lodge remains active, one of the oldest centres where rituals and rules are still preserved in their traditional form. In France, Masonic lodges are more fragmented, some leaning toward theology, others toward political philosophy. Across Africa, Freemasonry often intertwines with post-colonial elites in power. In Asia, particularly in India, the Philippines and Singapore, it thrives among intellectuals, entrepreneurs, and military circles. Today, Freemasonry takes many forms. In some places, it functions as a charitable society. In others, as an elite social club, where politicians and businessmen gather beyond the reach of public scrutiny. And in certain corners of the world, it still resembles a shadow system operating alongside official governments, much like it once did in 18th century America. There's one truth that's difficult to deny. Most nations with complex political histories, especially former colonies, have gone through periods where Freemasonry quietly stood at the center, but stayed hidden. Yet in the 21st century, this global order now faces a paradox. In the West, it's often viewed as outdated, overexposed, mythologized, even mocked. In the East and the global South, it still lives discreetly among the elite, but without the Enlightenment ideals it once claimed to uphold. Some say Freemasonry today is just a shell. Others say it's fragmented, no longer a unified force. But perhaps the more important question is this: if a secret society can survive over 300 years, through wars, revolutions, empires, and technology, then maybe it no longer needs to look the same. Because once a network becomes big enough, deep enough, and global enough, it doesn't need to preserve its old forms. It only needs to stay present, stay respected, and remain the place that power continues to turn to in times of uncertainty. So maybe the real question isn't, is Freemasonry still what it was during the American Revolution? But rather, is the world today still operating under the same principles, just in a different form? Freemasonry never needed to control the government. They only had to sit long enough, deep enough, in the quiet rooms behind closed doors until the world outside began operating exactly as they had designed. You won't hear them declare anything, because true power doesn't need to speak. This story wasn't told to accuse anyone. It's not about exposing a grand conspiracy. It's simply here to ask a question, one that's been ignored for far too long. How much of history is coincidence? And how much is the result of a system we were never allowed to name? Maybe it doesn't matter whether the lodge still exists today. Maybe what matters more is this: we've been living in a world shaped by symbols, rituals, and silent oaths, long before we ever learned how to ask questions. And by the time we start to notice, the game is already set. If you've watched this far, you probably feel it too, that something in our history was never fully said aloud. So what do you think? Is Freemasonry just coincidence? Or the foundation of it all? Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you want to keep uncovering the stories we weren't taught, the symbols we were told to ignore, and the truths that never made it into the textbooks, hit that subscribe button, not just so you don't miss the next video, but so we can keep unlocking the doors that have stayed shut for far too long.